The room smelled of antiseptic and sadness. Machines beeped quietly in rhythm with a fading heartbeat. Outside, a light drizzle tapped the hospital windows. Inside, Helen Monroe lay still, her pale face barely visible against the white hospital sheets. Cancer had taken almost everything from her. Her hair, her strength, and now, inch by inch, her life. Her husband, David Monroe, sat by her side. His hand held hers and his eyes were hollow, distant. Helen had been his high school sweetheart, the love of his life. They had been married for 23 years, raised 2 kids, built a life in a quiet suburban town just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. David, a respected lawyer, and Helen, a devoted stay-at-home mom, had always seemed like the perfect couple. But perfection is often just a veil, and that veil was about to be torn away. "Honey," Helen's voice was a fragile whisper, barely more than breath. David leaned in close, brushing a strand of her remaining hair from her forehead. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "There's something I have to tell you, before I go." Her tone had a chilling seriousness that made David's spine stiffen. "You don't have to." "I do," she interrupted. "Please, just listen." David nodded. "I lied to you about the kids." David's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "They're not yours," she said, eyes filling with tears. They're James's." James Blake. David froze. James Blake, his best friend, his best man, his fishing buddy, golf partner, college roommate, the man he trusted like a brother, the man he had brought into his home countless times. The room suddenly felt colder. "I'm sorry," Helen gasped. "It was only a few times, a long time ago. I thought it was over. But then, the kids came. I thought you'd never know, but I couldn't leave without telling you." Her grip on his hand weakened. Her lips trembled, and the machines around her began to scream. "Helen!" David shouted, but it was too late. Nurses rushed in. He was pulled away. Minutes later, a doctor confirmed what he already knew. Helen was gone, and with her, she had left behind a secret that shattered the very foundation of David's life. 3 days later, the Monroe residence was filled with the somber murmur of mourners. Friends, family, and neighbors came to pay their respects. David moved like a ghost through the rooms, nodding, thanking, smiling when necessary. His children, Emily, 19, and Michael, 16, were confused by his distant behavior. They thought it was grief, but it was rage. He couldn't look at them the same way. Every time he looked into their eyes, he searched for traces of James, the man who had betrayed him. He saw James's crooked smile in Michael's expressions. He saw James's green eyes in Emily's. James had come to the funeral. He stood at the edge of the room offering quiet condolences. David avoided him, but his blood boiled. The next day, David visited the Charleston Police Department. "I want to talk to someone about a possible crime," he said. "It's sensitive." Detective Maria Castillo was assigned to him. A seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, Maria was known for her sharp instincts and unrelenting pursuit of the truth. David sat across from her in a small interview room, his hands clenched, voice tight. "My wife just died. She told me something on her deathbed. She said our kids aren't mine. She said they're my best friends. I want this looked into." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Sir, I'm very sorry for your loss, but that's not a crime." David's jaw tensed. "Maybe not, but something doesn't sit right with me. She looked scared when she told me, like there was more she wasn't saying. I want to know the whole truth. I want a paternity test. I want James Blake investigated. I want to know what really happened back then." Maria tilted her head, studying him. "And you think this man, what, coerced her? Abused her?" "I don't know," David admitted, "but she was terrified, and she took something to the grave. I think there's more. I think you'll find it." It wasn't much to go on, but Maria had learned long ago that sometimes the smallest, oddest instincts were the ones worth following. She agreed to open an informal inquiry. Nothing official, just questions. She had no idea it would lead to murder. That night, David couldn't sleep. He went through old photo albums, staring at every image with fresh eyes. At a family trip to Myrtle Beach, James in the background of a picture, laughing with Helen. A 4th of July barbecue, James and Helen too close, smiling a little too wide. He'd been blind. The next morning, he scheduled paternity tests for both kids. They agreed, albeit confused. "I just need to know," he told them. "It's for closure." He didn't tell them the truth. Meanwhile, Maria Castillo pulled up James Blake's background. Nothing jumped out. A financial consultant, divorced, no priors, known to be friendly, charming. But there was one curious detail. 10 years ago, James had been questioned in an investigation involving a missing woman. Her name was Sandra Cole. She had worked briefly as a secretary at James's firm. She vanished without a trace. The case went cold. Maria made a note. She paid James a visit at his downtown office. "Mr. Blake, I'm following up on a matter involving Helen Monroe," she said calmly. James's face shifted subtly, the muscles tightening, just for a moment. "What about her?" "She passed recently. Her husband has asked us to look into a few things. He mentioned you two were close." James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We were friends, that's all." "Friends who saw each other outside of David's knowledge?" His smile faded. "We're not here to accuse anyone," she added quickly. "I'm just trying to understand the history. You ever speak to her recently?" James paused. Not in years." But Maria saw the lie. It was faint, but it was there. In the way his eyes avoided hers, in the twitch of his jaw. Something about James Blake didn't feel right. And if David was right, if Helen had been scared, maybe it wasn't just guilt she was taking to the grave. Maybe it was something darker, something deadly. Detective Maria Castillo stood in the doorway of the Monroe family home 3 days after her initial meeting with David. The neighborhood was quiet, trimmed hedges and well-kept lawns whispering the illusion of peace. But Maria had long since learned that dark truths often hid behind the nicest curtains. David opened the door. He looked worn, older than he had just a week ago. His eyes were sunken, not just from grief, but from the weight of betrayal. "Come in," he said. "The results came in this morning." Maria followed him to the kitchen. A brown envelope sat on the table like a loaded gun. David picked it up, opened it with shaky fingers, and slid the contents across to her. Maria read the lines again, then looked up. "So she was telling the truth," she said quietly. David nodded, jaw clenched. "Every word." "What about James Blake? Are you pursuing tests with him?" "I already filed the request. If he refuses, I'll get a court order." Maria leaned back in her chair, processing. "You said Helen seemed afraid before she died. Do you remember anything she said or did in the days leading up to her death that seemed off?" David thought. "She was quiet. She didn't want to talk about the past, but she kept looking over her shoulder, like she expected someone to come through the door. I thought it was just the meds or the stress. Now I think she was scared James might do something." "Do you think she was being threatened?" "I don't know. Maybe." David ran a hand through his hair. "But she was too scared to tell the kids. She asked me not to tell them." Maria nodded. "I'll dig deeper into James Blake's past. I need a warrant for his phone records, finances, and communications with Helen." As she stood to leave, David stopped her. "Detective, I need to know what happened. All of it. Not just the kids. I want the truth." "You'll get it," she said, "even if it's ugly." Maria drove to the storage facility that afternoon. The manager, a middle-aged man with a beer belly and a nicotine patch on his neck, confirmed that James Blake had rented a unit under the name Thomas Briggs. "Comes in every couple of weeks. Always alone," the man said, flipping through the logbook. With the warrant in hand, Maria and a team opened unit number 117. Inside was a collection of strange items. Plastic bins stacked with old photographs, a few suitcases, several burner phones, and a locked metal box. Maria picked through the photos first. They were all of Helen. Candid shots from cookouts, pool parties, vacations. Many of them were taken without her knowledge. Then she opened a small duffel bag. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters, all addressed to Helen, all in James's handwriting. "I miss you. I know you still love me. You shouldn't have picked him. They're mine. We both know it." Maria's stomach turned. There was obsession here, a long, festering one. Helen hadn't just cheated. She had been the subject of a quiet, consuming fixation that had never truly ended. She called David immediately. "I found something," she said. "It's deeper than we thought." That night, Maria sat at her desk, replaying the facts. Helen confessed on her deathbed. James had motive: jealousy, obsession, paternal connection. Helen feared something, possibly retribution, possibly exposure. A woman connected to James had disappeared 10 years ago. Was it possible that Helen wasn't the first woman James had controlled, threatened, or silenced? Maria pulled out the file for Sandra Cole. She read every line again, every statement, every gap in the record, and then she found something. A note scribbled by the original detective, now retired. Sandra confided in a friend that her boss had developed an unhealthy attachment. She was planning to quit. Friends said Sandra feared retaliation. There was a pattern. Sandra Cole disappeared right as she tried to leave James Blake's orbit. Helen Monroe died with a secret she had buried for 20 years, and James had been circling her the entire time. Maria leaned back in her chair, heart pounding. She had always followed the evidence, always trusted her gut, and now every thread led to one conclusion. James Blake wasn't just a scorned man. He was a ticking bomb. The Charleston Police Department buzzed with its usual rhythm: ringing phones, clacking keyboards, officers moving purposefully through narrow halls. But in Maria Castillo's office, time had slowed to a suffocating crawl. She sat at her desk, files spread out like a crime scene. Her gut told her something dangerous had been buried for years. And Helen Monroe's deathbed confession had ripped the lid off. James Blake was no longer just a grieving friend. He was a man with secrets. And the trail Maria was following smelled more and more like death. That morning, Maria met with Sandra Cole's mother, Darlene, at a small diner near the waterfront. The older woman hadn't spoken to police in years. "I thought you all forgot about her," Darlene said, fingers trembling as she stirred her coffee. "But I knew she didn't just vanish. My baby was scared. She said something was wrong at work." Maria nodded. "She ever mention anyone by name?" "She said her boss, James, had been calling her late at night, showing up outside her apartment. Said he told her she meant something to him. I told her to quit. She said she was gonna, but she never made it." Maria slid a photograph of Helen Monroe across the table. "You ever seen her before?" Darlene studied it, then nodded slowly. "I think she came by once. Real pretty. Looked nervous. Maybe 6 months before Sandra disappeared. Said she was looking for someone. Said she used to work with James. Left before I could ask her more." Helen had been digging. 10 years ago. That changed everything. Maria walked out of the diner with a storm in her chest. Helen hadn't just kept James's secret. She had tried to find out more. And maybe that curiosity had sealed her fate. Back at the precinct, Maria called forensics. "I want a full sweep of the contents from James Blake's storage unit, especially the lockbox." Hours later, the lab called back. "We found something," the tech said. "In the lockbox, a burner phone, an old audio cassette, and a necklace with the initials SC. We matched it to a photo in Sandra Cole's missing person file." Maria felt a chill spread through her spine. The tech continued. "The audio tape, you'll want to hear it. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done, James. You need to leave me alone." James Blake. "They're mine. You think you can keep that from me forever? After everything we had?" Helen Monroe. "There was nothing. It was a mistake. I love David." James Blake, him angry. No, you don't. You never did. You love him because he's safe. But I gave you something real. I gave you everything." Helen Monroe, fearful. "You're scaring me." James Blake, calmer, almost whispering. "If you say anything to anyone, I swear, Helen, you'll regret it." End of recording. Maria slammed her fist against the desk. Threats, obsession, proof of coercion. It was enough for a warrant, enough for surveillance, enough for an arrest if she could tie any of this to Helen's actual death. But that was the problem. Helen had died of cancer. On paper, it was natural causes, unless it wasn't. Maria returned to David Monroe's house later that evening. Emily and Michael were out. David looked like he hadn't slept in days. She played the tape for him. He sat in silence, pale, listening to the voice of his dead wife trembling under the pressure of the man he'd once called his brother. He threatened her, David said finally. She didn't die from cancer, did she? Maria hesitated. We're not there yet, but I've already filed to exhume Helen's body. I want a second autopsy. If she was poisoned, if something was accelerated, we'll find it. David looked down at his hands. I keep asking myself what I missed. She lived with that fear for years. She was protecting you, Maria said softly. And the kids, he laughed bitterly. Kids that aren't mine. Blood doesn't make you a father. But truth, that matters now. The next day, Maria pulled up surveillance from the hospital Helen died in. She fast-forwarded through hours of footage until she found it. 3 days before Helen's death, James Blake had visited. He wasn't on the visitor logs. No flowers. No card. He stood at her bedside for 17 minutes. No audio, but Helen's body language was unmistakable. Frightened, defensive. She tried to press the call button. He pulled her hand away. Maria grabbed her phone. I want that body exhumed. Now rain slammed against the Charleston Police Department windows as Detective Maria Castillo stared at the whiteboard in her office, now littered with crime scene photos, timelines, and taped transcripts. The word homicide was scrawled in red across the center. It hadn't just been a whispered threat or a family secret anymore. It was murder. Maria took a breath and picked up her phone. Get me a warrant. We're arresting James Blake. James Blake's office was modern and sterile, all steel frames and floor-to-ceiling glass. He sat behind his desk in a crisp navy suit, sipping coffee as if he hadn't orchestrated the death of the woman he claimed to love. The door burst open. Maria entered with 2 officers behind her. James Blake, you're under arrest for the murder of Helen Monroe. He barely flinched. You're making a mistake, Detective. She stepped forward, eyes locked with his. Number you did. 10 years ago, and again 3 weeks before she died. Cuffs clicked around his wrists. You have the right to remain silent. As the rights were read, James's eyes darkened, not in panic, but calculation, like he was already planning his next move. Maria slid a photo across the table. Sandra Cole, smiling at a beach picnic. You remember her too, don't you? His jaw tightened. We reopened her case. Guess what we found? A woman matching Helen Monroe's description visited her mother before Sandra disappeared. Helen knew something. Maria pulled out the final item, the necklace from the storage unit. She wore this the last day she was seen. It was in your locker. Explain that. James's lips parted, and for a moment, Maria thought he might confess. But instead, he leaned back and smiled. You're good, Detective, but you're about to find out that truth doesn't always win. That afternoon, Monroe family home. Maria sat in the living room with David Monroe and the kids. Emily and Michael were both there now, finally aware that something deeper had been going on. She had debated telling them the full truth. I want to be honest with you, she said. Your mother was being threatened. She was scared. That's why she told your father everything before she died. Emily frowned. So, James Blake? He killed her? We have evidence that he gave her a fatal dose of morphine the night she died. We believe it was meant to keep her quiet. Michael was silent, staring into his lap. Emily turned to David. Did you know? He nodded slowly. She told me the night she died. I didn't want to believe it. Tears filled Emily's eyes. What does that make us? Maria leaned forward. It makes you innocent people caught in someone else's lies. And we're going to make sure justice is served. Not just for Helen, but for you too. The next day, prosecutor's office. ADA Henry Wells paced his office, reviewing the file. We've got motive, opportunity, and evidence from the storage unit. But this guy's got money lawyers and no prior convictions. He'll plead out if we don't find more. Maria nodded. I've got an idea. She returned to the storage unit with a forensic anthropologist in tow. She had a feeling. Start digging under the unit's concrete floor, she told the team. He was careful with his threats, his stalking, his secrets. But even careful men get sloppy. An hour into the search, the team struck something hard. Not metal, bone. The medical examiner confirmed it later that night. Human remains female, estimated age 25 to 30, buried over a decade ago. Dental records confirmed it within the day. Sandra Cole had finally been found. Today, the Charleston Police Department, in cooperation with the District Attorney's Office, announces the arrest and formal charging of James Blake for the murders of Helen Monroe and Sandra Cole. Maria stepped back from the podium. Flashbulbs went off. Reporters shouted questions. David Monroe watched from a distance, Emily and Michael at his side. They were broken, yes, but not beyond repair. Later that night, Maria's home. The case file was closed, the evidence cataloged. Blake was denied bail and awaited trial. Maria poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window, rain streaking the glass like tears. Some cases leave bruises, others leave scars. But this one left a hole. Because justice may be blind, but the truth, it never dies. The Charleston County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice, its granite steps worn by generations of footsteps. But on this particular Monday morning, it felt like the center of a storm. Journalists lined the sidewalk, cameras flashing, reporters shouting into microphones. Inside, the trial of James Blake versus the state of South Carolina was set to begin. Detective Maria Castillo stood in the back of the courtroom, hands folded behind her back, watching as the man she had hunted for weeks was led into the courtroom in shackles. His face was clean-shaven, his expression calm, almost smug. James Blake had finally been charged with 2 counts of murder, Helen Monroe and Sandra Cole. He sat beside a high-priced defense attorney in a tailored suit, the kind that specialized in sowing doubt and twisting facts. But Maria had built this case brick by brick, and she wasn't about to let it fall apart in the courtroom. Opening statements, prosecutor Henry Wells stood first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this is not a story of sudden violence or heat-of-the-moment rage. This is a story of obsession, a story of a man who couldn't let go. James Blake spent over a decade stalking 2 women. One disappeared, and one died just weeks after confessing her fear. The evidence will show that Sandra Cole was buried in a concrete tomb beneath James Blake's storage unit. It will show that Helen Monroe was administered a lethal overdose, hours after Blake visited her hospital room without permission." He paused, and when the truth became a threat to him, James Blake made sure it was silenced, permanently. The defense countered with a calm, measured tone. "Mr. Blake is a successful man, a respected member of this community. Yes, he had a complicated history with Helen Monroe. But complicated does not mean criminal. The state's case relies on circumstantial evidence in speculative psychology. There's no direct link between my client and these deaths, just assumptions." Maria rolled her eyes, typical. But she knew what was coming. David took the stand in a charcoal suit, his voice steady despite the weight of emotion behind it. "Before she died," he said, "Helen told me our children weren't mine. She said James was the father. She also said she was scared, like something was coming." The defense tried to shake him. Is it possible she was confused, emotional, heavily medicated? David's eyes burned. She was clear, focused. She waited until the moment before her death to tell me the truth. That wasn't confusion. That was fear. "We examined Helen Monroe's toxicology report during a second autopsy," the doctor explained. "We found morphine in her system, twice the dose prescribed, enough to cause respiratory failure in someone already in a weakened state." "Could it have been an accident?" the defense asked. "Not likely. This level suggests intentional administration. The 4th lock on her machine had been tampered with. And who had access? The hospital staff and anyone who visited her room that night." Maria watched the jurors as they scribbled notes. When Maria took the stand, the courtroom fell quiet. She wore her badge-like armor. "I opened an informal investigation at the request of David Monroe. As I reviewed Helen's final days, I discovered inconsistencies in James Blake's statements. He denied seeing Helen, yet hospital surveillance placed him at her bedside the night before she died. She detailed the storage unit, the letters, the photographs, the audio tape, the necklace, the bones. James Blake kept physical and emotional tokens of his obsession. And under the floor of that unit, we recovered a body. Dental records confirmed it was Sandra Cole, A woman who went missing after expressing fear of her boss, the defendant. Objection, the defense barked. Speculation. Overruled, said the judge. Maria continued. This wasn't about love. This was about control. And when these women tried to break free, James Blake made sure they never could. Testimony, Emily Monroe. Emily, just 19, wore black slacks and a navy blouse. She looked nervous, but her voice didn't waver. I never knew anything about any of it. I thought James was just a friend of the family. Uncle James, we called him. The prosecutor nodded. Did he ever make you uncomfortable? She hesitated. Not really, but I do remember once, maybe 5 years ago, I saw him talking to Mom in the backyard. She was crying. He grabbed her arm. When I came out, he let go and smiled like nothing happened. She told me not to worry. Maria's stomach twisted. So many missed signs. James didn't testify. His lawyer advised against it. Instead, the defense paraded a series of character witnesses, co-workers, friends, even an ex-girlfriend who described James as passionate but harmless. But the cracks showed. The jury flinched. When Sandra Cole's photos appeared, they leaned forward during the tape playback. They watched James's reactions closely, and he showed none. No remorse, no regret. Prosecutor Wells stood again. 2 women, 1 man, a decade of lies, manipulation, and fear. The evidence tells a story James Blake never wanted us to hear. But Helen Monroe gave us the first page with her last breath. Now it's our duty to finish the book. The defense tried one last play. There is no smoking gun, no confession, no direct evidence tying Mr. Blake to Helen Monroe's death. Don't let suspicion replace proof. But suspicion was no longer all they had. 3 days later, the jury returned. David Monroe sat in the front row, Maria beside him. The foreman stood. On the count of first-degree murder in the case of Sandra Cole, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of second-degree murder in the case of Helen Monroe, we find the defendant guilty. James Blake didn't blink. David let out a breath that sounded like a lifetime releasing all at once. Maria didn't smile. She just closed her notepad. Justice had been served, but it had come late. That evening, at the Monroe home, David sat at the kitchen table with Emily and Michael. The weight in the room had shifted. Not vanished, but lighter somehow. I still don't know what's next, David said quietly. You don't have to, Emily said. You just have to keep showing up. Maria stopped by briefly. No badge, no files, just a woman saying goodbye to a case that had become personal. You kept your promise, David told her. I always do, she said. Then she looked at the kids. Your mom died protecting the truth. That's her legacy. Make sure it counts. The courtroom had fallen silent days ago. The reporters moved on, the flashbulbs stopped. The trial of James Blake was over. He had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But justice, Maria Castillo knew, was never a neat final chapter. It was an open wound stitched with careful hands, and healing took time. Charleston. 1 month later. The Monroe house, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a wraparound porch, looked the same from the outside. But inside, everything had changed. David Monroe now woke each day to a silence that felt both peaceful and painful. Helen's presence was gone, her laugh no longer echoing in the kitchen, her voice not drifting up the stairs. Still, he had the kids, and they had him. Emily had taken a leave of absence from college. Michael saw a counselor twice a week. They were adjusting, bit by bit. At the breakfast table, David sipped coffee while Emily scrolled through her phone. You okay? He asked. She looked up. Yeah. Just looking at internship options. I don't want to sit still anymore. David smiled faintly. You're stronger than you think. Michael came down the stairs dragging his backpack. Bus is early again. I'll walk. David stood. I'll drive you. They left the house together, like they used to. But there was no illusion anymore. They weren't the same family, but they were still a family. That had to be enough. Charleston Police Department Detective Maria Castillo stared at the vacant whiteboard in her office. The surface wiped clean after weeks of crime scene photos, names, and red lines that had all pointed to James Blake. Her desk was neat, files stacked, Case closed, but the case hadn't left her. Helen Monroe's voice still echoed in her mind. That final recording, the tremble, the fear. It haunted Maria in quiet moments, in the pause between phone calls, in the silence between cases. Her captain knocked. "You taking a day off or just meditating with your eyes open?" Maria smirked. "Something like that." He leaned against the doorway. "You did good work, Castillo. Two families finally got answers. I know you've had this one heavy on your shoulders." She nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't just about Helen or Sandra. It was about how long someone like James Blake can wear a mask and fool everyone around him." The captain tilted his head. "Think about taking a week. Clear your head." "I might," she said, "but first I've got one more stop." Sandra Cole's mother, Darlene's home. Darlene Cole answered the door slowly. She hadn't let many people in since the trial ended. But when she saw Maria, she opened the door without hesitation. "I brought you this," Maria said, holding out a small wooden box. Inside, Sandra's necklace, the one recovered from the storage unit. "We released it from evidence." Darlene took the box like it was made of glass. Her fingers trembled. "Thank you," she whispered. "I just wanted you to know she mattered. We didn't forget her." Tears filled the woman's eyes. "I thought I'd never see the day." "You did," Maria said gently, "and now she can rest." Cemetery, Helen Monroe's grave. A week later, Maria stood beside Helen's grave. She wasn't one for sentiment, but this case had burrowed into her in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the tape. Maybe it was David. Or maybe it was knowing how long one woman had carried the burden of silence to protect the people she loved. The tombstone was simple. Helen Grace Monroe, beloved mother, loyal wife, courageous soul. Maria knelt down, placed a single white lily on the grass. "We got him," she said softly. "It's over." She stood and walked back to her car, the wind brushing past like a whisper, not of pain, but of peace. Meanwhile, Greenville County Jail. James Blake sat alone in his cell, staring at the concrete wall. He didn't speak, didn't eat much. The other inmates knew who he was. They whispered. He ignored them. What haunted James wasn't the trial. It wasn't the evidence. It was Helen's voice. That last conversation. It looped in his mind like a skipping record. There was nothing. It was a mistake. "I love David." That sentence had killed him more than the sentence of the court. He would never be free of it. 3 months later, Emily's journal entry. "I used to think I knew my story, a happy family, loving parents, a future I could see clearly. But it turns out part of my story belonged to someone else. Someone who lied, manipulated, and broke the people I loved. But that's not all I am. I am my mother's strength, my father's resilience, my brother's protector, and I'm still writing the next chapter. On my terms." Emily Monroe. Maria's apartment. Midnight. Maria sat on her balcony, wine glass in hand, watching the streetlights below. The city moved on. Cases came and went. But she'd remember Helen and Sandra and the silence that nearly buried the truth. She raised her glass to the night, to the ones who speak, even when it costs everything. It was a warm spring morning in Charleston, the kind of morning where the breeze smelled like blooming jasmine and the sun bathed the sidewalks in gold. Life was moving again, slow but steady, for everyone who had been caught in James Blake's twisted web. But for Detective Maria Castillo, the last chapter of this case hadn't been written yet. Not truly. There was one last piece of the puzzle. Charleston Police Department, Cold Case Division. A nondescript envelope sat on Maria's desk. No return address. Inside, a single photograph, grainy and old. It was of Helen Monroe standing outside a small law office in Mount Pleasant. 10 years ago, a man stood beside her. Not James Blake, not David Monroe, a stranger. On the back of the photo, in shaky handwriting, "She knew more. Look deeper." Maria sat back in her chair, stomach tightening. Who had sent this? And what had Helen known beyond what was already revealed? She cross-referenced the building in the background, a law firm that had closed in 2016. The man in the picture, identified by old Bar Association records as Elliot Crane, an estate attorney who'd gone into early retirement after a brief but messy lawsuit involving missing wills and forged documents. A call to Crane's current residence went unanswered. Maria grabbed her coat. This case wasn't just about murder anymore. Elliot Crane's residence, Mount Pleasant. The house was modest, curtains drawn, law books stacked behind frosted windows. Crane answered the door in a faded bathrobe, thick glasses perched on his nose. "Detective Castillo," he said, already knowing why she was there. "I wondered when someone would come." "Let's talk," Maria said. Inside, over a table cluttered with unopened mail and an old chessboard, Crane poured 2 cups of black coffee. "She came to me in 2014, he said. "Helen. She didn't want to change her will. She wanted to hide a letter, said she needed to keep it locked away with someone she could trust, but someone who didn't know her husband or her friend." "She said that?" "She was terrified," Crane nodded. "Said if anything happened to her, this letter might be the only thing that kept her children safe." "Where is it?" He walked to a filing cabinet, pulled a thick manila folder labeled Private HGM. Inside was a handwritten letter, yellowed with age, addressed, "To my children, Emily and Michael. In case I'm gone before I can tell you everything." Maria scanned the first page. Her heart dropped. Excerpt: Helen Monroe's final letter. "I loved you both from the moment you came into this world. No matter what biology says, you are mine. I never told you about James because I was ashamed. Not just of the affair, but of how it began. James was not gentle, not honest. He convinced me that what we had was love. But it wasn't. It was pressure, coercion. I said no, more than once. And still, it happened. I've lived in silence because I didn't know how to speak it aloud. And I was afraid you'd hate me, or worse, think you came from something wrong. But listen to me. What he did does not define you. What you become, how you carry this, that's what matters. David is your father in all the ways that count. And if I'm gone, I need you to know the truth. Not because it will fix things, but because it will set you free." Mom Maria stood at Helen's grave the next morning, letter in hand, sunlight painting the grass. "She gave them everything," she whispered. "Even the truth. She didn't need to keep the letter. She didn't need to submit it into evidence. The trial was done. The case closed. But she gave it to David Monroe anyway. He read it in silence, sitting alone on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. When he finished, he pressed it to his chest like something sacred. Later that night, he knocked on his children's doors, not to tell them anything new, but to simply say, "She loved you more than you'll ever know." 1 year later, Charleston. A garden bloomed in the backyard of the Monroe home, a small plaque nestled among the roses. In memory of Helen Grace Monroe. Truth, love, courage. Emily had gone back to college. Michael had joined the high school newspaper, writing stories that mattered. David, he had started volunteering, working with domestic abuse survivors, hoping to make a dent in someone else's story. Maria visited sometimes. No badge, just a friend. They'd talk, not about the case, but about what came after. Helen Monroe died too soon, but in her final moments, she found the strength to do what so many cannot: speak the truth, no matter the cost. That truth exposed a predator. It uncovered a body. It set a family free. In the end, justice didn't come in a blaze of glory. It came in a whisper, in a hospital bed, in a quiet letter no one was supposed to find.